Attica Correctional Facility is one of the most studied prison uprisings in U.S. history. This story is not about chaos alone, it's about systemic failure, race, power, and state violence. When guards lost control, the Attica Prison Massacre, New York, USA. A prison built to break, not to listen. Attica was never designed to fail quietly. Long before gunfire echoed across its yard, before helicopters circled overhead and politicians faced the cameras, Attica Correctional Facility had already become a pressure chamber. Every condition inside its walls pushed toward confrontation. The only unknown was when, not if. Located in rural western New York, Attica was built to isolate. Distance itself was part of the punishment. Most of the men imprisoned there came from New York City, separated from family, legal support, and any meaningful oversight by hours of travel. That isolation was not incidental. It was structural. Attica opened in the early 20th century as a maximum security institution designed for control, discipline, and silence. But by the late 1960s and early 1970s, the prison reflected a country in turmoil. Outside its walls, the United States was grappling with civil rights, anti-war protests, and deep racial divisions. Inside Attica, those same tensions were compressed into a confined space governed by rigid authority and minimal accountability. The prison population was overwhelmingly Black and Latino. The guards were almost entirely white, drawn largely from the surrounding rural communities. This racial divide shaped daily life inside Attica in ways that were impossible to ignore. Authority was enforced not just through rules, but through posture, language, and punishment. Inmates at Attica lived under conditions that were harsh even by the standards of the time. Cells were small. Medical care was limited. Meals were inadequate. Access to basic hygiene was restricted. Prisoners were allowed one roll of toilet paper per month. Showers were infrequent. Medical complaints were often dismissed. What made these conditions explosive was not just deprivation, but the absence of a grievance system that worked. Complaints went unanswered. Petitions were ignored. Requests for dialogue were treated as challenges to authority. Attica was governed by a philosophy common to American prisons at the time: order must be maintained at all costs, and authority must never appear negotiable. That philosophy would prove fatal. The men inside Attica were not a unified political movement when the uprising began. They were individuals navigating survival in a system that offered no dignity. Over time, however, shared experiences created solidarity. Prisoners began discussing conditions. They shared stories. They compared treatment. Slowly, they realized something dangerous. Their suffering was not accidental. It was systemic. By 1971, tensions inside Attica had reached a breaking point. Small incidents escalated quickly. Discipline became more aggressive. Punishments became more frequent. Guards and inmates viewed each other not as adversaries within a system, but as enemies locked in opposition. The administration believed firmness would restore order. Instead, it deepened resentment. The spark came in early September. A confrontation between inmates and guards escalated into violence. Control slipped. Gates were breached. Guards were taken hostage. For the first time in Attica's history, inmates controlled a portion of the prison. What followed was not immediate chaos. It was organization. Prisoners gathered in the yard. They established leadership. They issued demands, not for escape, but for basic human rights. Adequate food. Medical care. Fair discipline. Religious freedom. An end to racial abuse. They asked for observers. Lawyers. Journalists. Politicians. They asked to be heard. Outside the prison, New York State officials faced a choice that would define the event forever. Negotiate, and risk appearing weak. Or reassert control, at any cost. Attica had reached the moment where authority could no longer rely on silence. And the state was watching. When control slipped at Attica Correctional Facility, it did not collapse into chaos the way authorities feared. Instead, something far more unsettling happened for the state. The inmates organized. By the morning after the initial uprising, a large section of the prison yard was firmly under prisoner control. Guards were held hostage, but they were not immediately harmed. Makeshift rules were established. Discipline was enforced internally. Violence among inmates was discouraged. What emerged was not anarchy, but an improvised order born out of urgency. This alone challenged the state's narrative. For decades, American prison policy rested on a single assumption: incarcerated people could not govern themselves without descending into brutality. Attica contradicted that belief in real time, under the watch of the media and the state. The inmates' first priority was communication. They understood instinctively that isolation would be fatal. If the state could seal Attica off from public view, force would follow. So they demanded observers, lawyers, journalists, religious leaders, civil rights figures, anyone whose presence would slow a violent response. Those observers began arriving within hours. And with them came cameras, microphones, and a national audience. Inside the yard, prisoners drafted a list of demands. These were not radical calls for escape or immunity. They were concrete and specific: adequate food, medical care, religious freedom, fair disciplinary practices, protection from racial abuse, and meaningful parole consideration. They demanded amnesty for actions taken during the uprising, knowing that without it, retaliation would be inevitable. The demands revealed something critical: this was not a spontaneous riot. It was a political confrontation shaped by years of accumulated grievances. Outside the walls, the response hardened quickly. New York State officials faced immense pressure. Law enforcement unions demanded decisive action. Political advisors warned against appearing weak. The governor, recently elected and ambitious, viewed Attica as a test of authority with national implications. Negotiations began, but they were constrained from the start. Officials met with inmate representatives, listened to demands, and offered partial concessions. But amnesty, the core issue for the prisoners, was categorically rejected. From the state's perspective, granting it would legitimize rebellion. From the prisoners' perspective, denying it guaranteed bloodshed. The gap was unbridgeable. As talks dragged on, the atmosphere inside Attica grew heavier. Inmates knew time was not on their side. State police gathered nearby. National Guard units stood ready. Equipment arrived quietly. Helicopters became a constant presence. The state prepared for force while speaking the language of negotiation. This duality did not go unnoticed. Observers inside the prison reported rising anxiety among inmates. They saw barricades strengthen, voices grow hoarse, and exhaustion set in. Despite the effort to maintain order, the psychological toll was immense. Men slept little. Food was scarce. Every hour felt provisional. Yet discipline largely held. Hostages were protected. Medical attention was given when possible. Internal disputes were mediated. This was not because the situation was humane, it was because the prisoners understood the optics. Any harm to hostages would justify immediate violence from the state. That restraint would not save them. Outside, public opinion fractured. Some Americans saw Attica as a legitimate protest against inhumane conditions. Others saw it as criminal rebellion requiring swift suppression. Media coverage intensified, often simplifying complex realities into stark binaries: order versus chaos, law versus lawlessness. Race played a decisive role in how the event was interpreted. The image of mostly black and Latino inmates confronting a white-led state apparatus echoed broader national conflicts. Attica became a proxy for unresolved tensions over civil rights, policing, and authority. Inside the prison, Inmates were acutely aware of this symbolism. Many spoke openly about dignity, humanity, and equality. They framed their demands in moral terms, not criminal ones. That framing made the situation more dangerous for the state. A successful negotiation would signal that incarcerated people could extract reform through collective action. Failure would reaffirm the primacy of force. As the days passed, patience thinned. State officials increasingly bypassed negotiators and observers. Tactical planning accelerated. Police commanders assessed entry routes. Weapons were distributed. Medical teams were briefed, not for inmates, but for officers. The decision to retake Attica by force was not announced publicly, but it became increasingly inevitable. Inside the yard, inmates sensed the shift. Negotiations stalled. Promises grew vague. Time stretched. Hope narrowed. They debated their options. Surrender without amnesty meant punishment, beatings, and extended sentences. Continued resistance meant death. They were trapped between two certainties. Observers reported urgent pleas from inmate leaders asking the state to return to genuine negotiation. Those pleas were acknowledged, and then ignored. Political calculation outweighed humanitarian concern. On the final morning before the assault, the yard was tense but quiet. Inmates gathered, spoke, waited. Hostages were positioned together. There was no riot in progress. No active violence. No immediate threat. From the state's perspective, that calm was irrelevant. Control had been lost. And that, alone, was unacceptable. The order was given. What would follow would redefine Attica forever, and mark one of the most controversial uses of state force in American correctional history. By the morning of September 13, 1971, the outcome at Attica Correctional Facility had already been decided, just not announced. Negotiations still existed on paper. Observers were still present. Prisoners were still holding hostages without having killed a single one. From the outside, it appeared as though dialogue, however fragile, remained possible. But behind closed doors, the state had moved on. For New York authorities, Attica was no longer a negotiation problem. It had become a control problem. And control, once lost in a maximum security prison, was something officials believed could only be restored through force. The decision to retake Attica was framed internally as unavoidable. Publicly, it would later be described as a tragic necessity. But in the hours leading up to the assault, planning was precise, deliberate, and overwhelmingly violent in its scope. Hundreds of state troopers and correctional officers were assembled. They were armed with shotguns, rifles, and handguns. Many had never trained for prison retaking operations. Some had been told they would face armed inmates, despite no credible evidence that prisoners possessed firearms. That false assumption would prove fatal. Shortly before the assault, officials made one final announcement to the inmates via loudspeaker. The message was brief and ambiguous. It did not outline clear terms of surrender. It did not guarantee safety. It did not address amnesty. For the prisoners in the yard, the message sounded less like an offer and more like a warning. Then came the helicopters. As they descended overhead, releasing tear gas into the prison yard, confusion spread instantly. Visibility collapsed. Breathing became difficult. The yard, once a place of tense but organized control, dissolved into chaos. Almost immediately, gunfire erupted. State troopers fired indiscriminately into the yard. Shotgun blasts echoed across concrete walls. Bullets struck inmates and hostages alike. There was no clear line of fire. No controlled advance. No distinction between threat and surrender. Within minutes, the assault was effectively over. The imbalance of force was absolute. When the shooting stopped, the scale of what had happened began to emerge. Dozens of inmates lay dead or wounded. Hostages, whom authorities had claimed were being executed by prisoners, had in fact been killed by police gunfire. That truth would take years to fully acknowledge. In the immediate aftermath, officials controlled the narrative. Early press statements falsely claimed that inmates had slit hostages' throats. Those claims were repeated widely before autopsies disproved them. The damage was already done. Public perception hardened. Sympathy eroded. The state framed the assault as a rescue operation that had narrowly prevented further bloodshed. But evidence told a different story. Autopsies revealed that every hostage death was caused by gunshot wounds inflicted by law enforcement. None had been killed by inmates. Many inmates had been shot multiple times. Some were shot while surrendering. Others were killed after the yard was secured. The assault was not just violent. It was uncontrolled. In the hours and days following the retaking of Attica, violence did not end. It shifted. Surviving inmates were forced to crawl naked through mud and broken glass. Beatings were widespread. Medical care was delayed or denied. Retaliation replaced order. The prison was back under state control, but it was governed by vengeance rather than justice. For the men inside Attica, the message was unmistakable: resistance would be answered not only with death, but with humiliation. Outside the prison, families waited for news. Many were told nothing. Names of the dead were slow to be released. Identification was chaotic. Grief unfolded alongside disbelief. As details leaked out, contradictions became impossible to ignore. Journalists began questioning official accounts. Medical examiners contradicted state claims. Witnesses spoke of surrendering inmates being shot. Observers who had been present during negotiations expressed shock at the level of force used. Attica moved from crisis to scandal. The governor, who had authorized the assault, defended his decision publicly. He framed the retaking as a last resort necessary to restore law and order. Political allies echoed that language. But the cost was undeniable. By the final count, 43 people were dead, 33 inmates and 10 hostages. All hostages died from police gunfire. No guards or troopers were killed by inmates. This fact alone shattered the justification for the scale of the assault. Yet accountability remained elusive. Investigations were announced. Commissions were formed. Hearings were held. But responsibility was diffused across agencies, chains of command, and political offices. No senior official faced criminal charges for the decision to use lethal force. For years, the official narrative minimized state responsibility. The story of inmates as savages and guards as heroes persisted in public discourse, even as evidence contradicted it. It would take decades of lawsuits, advocacy, and investigative journalism to correct the historical record. Attica became a wound that refused to close. For the prison system, the assault reinforced a dangerous precedent: when control is threatened, overwhelming force is acceptable, even if it kills those it claims to protect. For incarcerated people across the country, Attica became a warning. For society, it became a test of whether truth could survive power. In the aftermath of the assault, Attica Correctional Facility returned to a version of normality that concealed rather than resolved what had happened. The prison resumed operations. Guards returned to their posts. Inmates were redistributed, disciplined, and silenced. Officially, the crisis was over. But the consequences of Attica were only beginning. For the state of New York, the immediate priority was damage control. Press briefings emphasized restored order. Officials repeated the claim that the assault had been necessary to save hostages' lives. Early reports alleging that inmates had murdered guards were allowed to circulate widely, even as internal evidence contradicted them. That narrative hardened quickly. Once a story takes root in public consciousness, reversing it becomes almost impossible. And for years, Attica existed in the American imagination not as a state massacre, but as a cautionary tale about inmate savagery and the dangers of conceding authority. The truth was buried beneath authority, fear, and time. Families of the dead inmates were among the first to challenge the official account. They demanded autopsy reports, witness statements, and explanations for why their loved ones had been shot repeatedly. Survivors spoke of beatings, torture, and humiliation after the yard had been secured. Observers who had participated in negotiations described a situation that had not required the level of force used. But their voices were fragmented. The legal system moved slowly and selectively. Multiple investigations were launched in the years following the massacre. Some focused on inmate behavior during the uprising. Others examined police conduct. None produced immediate accountability at the highest levels. Responsibility dissolved into committees, commissions, and procedural language. The governor who authorized the assault remained politically influential. Senior officials defended their decisions. Law enforcement agencies closed ranks. The idea that the state might be criminally responsible for the deaths of inmates and hostages alike was treated as unthinkable. Attica exposed a fundamental imbalance in American justice, the ability of the state to investigate itself. For incarcerated survivors, the years that followed were marked by retaliation and neglect. Many faced extended sentences. Some were transferred to harsher facilities. Complaints of abuse were ignored or dismissed. Medical and psychological trauma went largely untreated. The system did not seek reconciliation. It sought closure. That closure was false. It took decades of civil litigation for fragments of accountability to emerge. Lawsuits filed by survivors and families slowly forced evidence into the public record. Depositions contradicted early official claims. Documents revealed planning decisions that minimized negotiation and prioritized force. In 2000, nearly 30 years after the massacre, the state of New York agreed to a financial settlement with surviving inmates. Years later, families of slain hostages also received compensation. These settlements were significant, but they came without admissions of wrongdoing. Money replaced justice. For many, that trade felt hollow. Attica's legacy extended far beyond courtrooms. It reshaped the language of prison reform and protest. The massacre became a reference point, a warning invoked whenever incarcerated people organized, negotiated, or resisted. Authorities learned their own lesson as well: never allow a prison to become a public stage again. Media access to prison uprisings tightened. Negotiation protocols became more rigid. The presence of outside observers was increasingly limited. Rather than preventing violence, these changes often ensured that future confrontations would unfold in darkness. Attica also hardened prison policy nationally. Rather than addressing the conditions that led to the uprising, racial inequality, overcrowding, lack of grievance mechanisms, many states responded by increasing security, isolation, and punishment. Supermax prisons expanded. Solitary confinement became more common. Dialogue was replaced by containment. The logic was simple: control must never appear negotiable. This logic carried a cost. Attica had demonstrated that suppressing grievances does not eliminate them. It only postpones confrontation. Yet prison systems across the country doubled down on silence rather than reform. For decades, the massacre remained an open wound in American history. It was referenced in academic studies, activist movements, and cultural works, but rarely confronted honestly at the political level. Only with time did the narrative begin to shift. Investigative journalism revisited the evidence. Declassified documents surfaced. Former officials acknowledged mistakes. Public understanding slowly aligned with documented fact: the state's assault had killed hostages and inmates alike, and the subsequent cover-up had deepened the injustice. Attica became what it had always been, not a story of chaos, but of power. Power exercised without accountability. Power defended through misinformation. Power shielded by institutional silence. The massacre forced an uncomfortable question that still has no easy answer. What happens when a state loses moral authority but retains physical force? Attica answered that question in blood. Today, Attica Correctional Facility still operates. Its walls remain. Its gates still close behind incarcerated men. But its name carries a weight no architecture can erase. It stands as a reminder that prisons are not just places of confinement. They are mirrors reflecting how societies handle conflict, inequality, and dissent. When prisons are governed by fear rather than justice, when dialogue is treated as weakness, and when control becomes more important than human life, Attica is the outcome. Not as an exception. As a consequence. The massacre did not happen because guards lost control for 4 days. It happened because the system refused to listen for decades. And that refusal, more than the uprising, more than the gunfire, is what defines Attica's place in history.